Hi, my name's Carla. Hi, I'm Carla, and I'll be doing a book review for Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. So I've kind of broken down the topics into two key topics. The first one being the way in which we think, which is described as a system one, which is a fast thinking process, and system two, which is a slow thinking process. And this kind of breaks down the intuitive and quick thinking that is often susceptible to biases versus our controlled, considered, analytical, more cognitive, strained thinking, which is the system two. The second key topic is how does this thinking then make us susceptible to poor judgment and decision making, particularly from the influence of heuristics and biases, and leading to overconfidence. Basically, my understanding of Kahneman's book is our thinking is flawed, and we require a certain level of training to identify the errors that we make, which is naturally inherent to us based on these systems of thinking. And the purpose of this book is then to kind of guide you in a way of identifying the mistakes that you might make and improving the way you think, so then you can make better judgments and better information processing. And this is super important. Not only relates directly to the unit of organizational behavior, where we've spoken about judgment and decision making, but it also ties into other concepts such as motivation and leadership and positive psychology, and also improves our overall emotional intelligence with a better awareness and understanding of our thought processing. I think this is also especially poignant in organizational environment where forming judgments and decision making is really critical, and also lends itself to the kinds of relationships we build and how working with people. It's really important to not only understand ourselves and where we can improve in our thinking, but also understanding others, and that as we spoke about in class, really forms a really great organizational culture. There was so much to take from this book. So I really thought about the top 3 lessons for me personally, based on my personality, and what really struck me as very interesting and something I hadn't considered. First being that humans are not statistically inclined. And this was interesting to me as someone with a mathematical background. I've always enjoyed maths, and I've done a lot of probability. And it was really interesting for me to do some of the experiments that were in the book. For example, the one relating to the librarian and the farmer, in terms of which person was more likely to be a farmer or a librarian based on a description. And the evidence was that most people didn't even consider any statistical inferencing. And I found this really interesting because I did this experiment on a few of my friends as well. And even though they knew I was up to something in terms of a critical question that was maybe it had a bit of a trick element, no one considered the statistical nature. And so I found that really interesting. And this kind of lack of adeptness with probability, and this kind of follows through with our involuntary nature to be quite irrational. And I found this really interesting. The second learning point for me was how people judge competence by combining 2 aspects, being perceived strength and trustworthiness. And this led to the concept that we are biologically predisposed to reject people that don't suit our own values, and particularly with leadership and competence, it is that balance of strength and trustworthiness. What I found really interesting with this, though, is how someone might appear dominant based on their facial features is kind of has a threatening notion, although we still want them to be trustworthy. And this almost seemed like a bit of a contradiction to me when I was reading it. I thought, well, how can you be dominant and threatening, but also trustworthy? And it kind of made me think about the notion of power and people being feared or loved. That kind of fits into that kind of notion of defined competence. And that was interesting for me as well, and also quite sad, because I kind of reflected on myself and thought, well, I hope I do a bit more due diligence with my judgments of people, and made me think about how I perceive people. And it made me think about some examples of competence and I have been susceptible to thinking someone in a really nice suit and very well presented and seeming a bit aloof or mysterious, or can often give off that kind of dominance or trustworthiness. The last lesson I learned was what you see is all there is. That kind of describes how humans are naturally overconfident. And the confidence that individuals have on their beliefs depends on the quality of the story that they can tell about what they see. And that's even the case if they see very little. An interesting experiment in the book described that one-sided, when when participants of a study were given one-sided evidence versus participants that were given two-sided evidence, the participants with one-sided evidence were more confident in their judgments than those that saw both sides. This really challenged the way that I'd previously thought about my ability to recognize information and make a sound judgment, as it almost sounds contradictory. You think you'd be able to make a more informed decision or a more informed judgment if you have both sides of the story. And I've always thought that, more information, more well-rounded information means that I will make a better judgment, and that's what I believe. But in fact, I probably feel the times when I feel most confident about topics is probably when I don't have all the facts, and that's represented in this this notion of being overconfident. And it was interesting to know that people that know little, or the less you know, makes it easier for you to fit what you do know into a coherent pattern. But that was very interesting, as I thought that was quite contradictory to what I thought would be the way that I'd naturally think. Overall, I think Kahneman provides a really robust set of theories that are applicable for neurotypical people, but my critique today is, would these theories be applicable to the neurodiverse members of our society? In particular, idea one being the two systems of thinking fast and slow, and second of all, the idea of the impact of heuristics and biases on the way that we think and make judgments and decisions. And the reason I thought about these two things was that I have a brother who is autistic, and for example, his system 1 and system 2 processing, I think, would be different to me in the sense that he doesn't have that natural intuition or quick thinking, effortless decisions, subconscious day-to-day choices and information processing that a neurotypical person like myself would have. Small bits of information, small situation analysis often can be quite difficult for him to process, and there's a lot of cognitive strain with that. So I really wonder whether the functioning of his system 1 and system 2 would be the same as the functioning of my system 1 and system 2. An example of this is the other day he said to me, Kyle, I finally realized the purpose of a dog. And something like that comes quite intuitively and natural to neurotypical people. It makes you happy. It's fun. There's a lot of enjoyment. Whereas for him, that had obviously been a really big thinking process to understand why someone would want to purchase a dog. The second idea would be the impact of heuristics and biases. And I personally think my brother wouldn't be as susceptible to these biases. And I noticed that in conversations that I have with him and with my family. He doesn't have the same level of emotional involvement with conversations, and he doesn't rely on emotional experiences or that doesn't really influence his decisions. So that's what I also question with this. And I think this is a problem that would need to be looked at as, first of all, about the inclusivity of this. If I had a neurodiverse condition and I'm reading this book, I'm not sure if it would be as relatable as someone who is neurotypical. I can't speak from experience, but they might not get the same learnings out of it. And also the increasing representation of neurodiverse people in our workforce. And I think that's why it's really important that the way we understand thinking is not just a one size fits all, and people think differently and respond differently and have different preferences and functionings. And I think that's especially important in organizational behavior as we understand the best ways in which organizations can work with their employers. So some revision suggestions would be maybe to a lot of the experiments to apply this to neurodiverse members. And I'm not just talking about autistic people, but across the board as well. Bipolar would be a great one to look at as well, to see whether they yield the same results and the same impacts. Finally, some practical advice. There was so much to take from this, and so I'll just do a brief advice spiel. Other than read the book, I think the book is really, really great, and I've taken so much from it. And also to continue that learning of thinking. As I said earlier, it's not natural for us to think about the way we think, and I think it's really, really important, as I've learned from reading this. So I'm going to continue my learning with that. In relation to overconfidence, I think remaining really attentive and cautious to our talents, to not fall into that overconfidence of our abilities, and also to, in conjunction with that, remembering the aspect of luck and chance. I didn't really speak about it earlier, but that was a really interesting point for me, that we're very causal in our identification of why things happen, and we forget that there's a big element of chance. And I think that's also really important to remember in all aspects of our life. And finally, learning more about probability, which is something I'm going to do even with a maths background. I feel like after reading this, I don't have the right intuitive understanding of it as I thought I did. So looking at likelihoods, randomness, statistical inferencing, the importance of sample size. I think knowing more about probability and statistical inferencing is super important, and would really impact the way we think. And yeah, Thank you.